A young virginal heroine is stalked and eventually attacked by a psychopathic killer in a moment of destructive eroticism. This is the disturbing scene depicted at the climax of almost every slasher film. In this presentation, I will examine two of the most widely recognized films in this subgenre, Halloween and A Nightmare on Elm Street, through a psychoanalytic lens in order to better understand the emotional and symbolic significance of this violent exchange between the protagonist and villain. Specifically, I will analyze these films in the light of Jungian scholar Erich Neumann's text, Amor and Psyche, in which he proposed that during the development of the feminine psyche, the subject must undergo a rite of passage called the marriage to death. During this stage of development, the individual is either literally or symbolically wed to death, embodied by a monstrous villain, and must confront this figure in order to attain psychological maturity. This encounter with death symbolically expresses the act of sexual intercourse and is necessary for the subject to cross the threshold into adulthood. Neumann goes on to state that the marriage to death theme is a common narrative trope that is featured in myths, tales, and other cultural texts. In my research, I propose that this theme is dramatized in the slasher film through the violent confrontation between the final girl and the killer. Though the heroines in these films are not literally married to their villainous counterparts, they share a sexually charged relationship rooted in repression and express their libidinal impulses through the violence they perpetrate against one another. It is through her intelligence and wit that the slasher heroine is able to confront and overcome death to successfully reach the state of individuation and become a fully realized adult. Neumann was a German-born Israeli philosopher and psychologist who wrote extensively on the role of archetypes in art, religion, and myth. His most notable works include The Origins and History of Consciousness, The Great Mother, and Amor and Psyche, all of which address the arduous process that the human psyche undergoes during maturation. He was one of Jung's closest intellectual allies and essentially functioned as his protege, carrying on his work concerning parental archetypes in psychological development. In Amor and Psyche, he uses Greco-Roman mythology to outline the 5 stages involved in the development of the feminine psyche, which includes the introduction, the marriage to death, the act, the 4 tasks, and the happy ending. In his analysis of the marriage to death, Neumann characterizes this phase as a symbolic articulation of the physical act of intercourse, as experienced by the subject. He describes this event as a rite of passage that marks the individual's transition into adulthood, and is often experienced metaphorically as a terrifying act of sacrifice, in which the subject is offered up to a monster, dragon, wizard, or evil spirit. In such narratives, the villain threatens to arrest the psychological development of the female protagonist, and consequently she must confront and overcome him in order to reach maturity. Such stories feature a female protagonist who is either literally or metaphorically wed to a death-like male figure, and must uncover the truth about her adversary in order to escape his fatal grip. By surviving her encounter with this monster, the heroine reaches a new level of consciousness and fulfills her psychological potential. Within the framework of the slasher film, we see this dynamic occur between the heroine and the villain. The female protagonist is faced with the responsibility of subduing or conquering the figure of death that is manifested in the form of a masked or disfigured villain. In these narratives, sexual impulses are sublimated into violence, and the act of killing is transformed into the perverted expression of the villain's masculine sexual energy. At the climax of the slasher film, the heroine encounters the personification of death, and must overcome her shock and fear in order to end his destructive reign. As Carol Clover points out, it is the final girl who looks death in the face and possesses the integrity and courage to overcome him in the final act of the film. Through the process of waging battle with the villain, the female protagonist undergoes a process of maturation that marks her transformation into adulthood. Developing the rational facets of her psyche, she must master the art of logos in order to develop a strategy to surmount her adversary's attacks and conquer him. This rite of passage is accompanied by the revelation of a strange kinship that she shares with the villain and binds the two of them together on a psychological level. This relationship is either explicitly acknowledged within the narrative or revealed symbolically through the aesthetic structure of the film. This motif is most readily observed in Halloween, as an intense psychological bond between Laurie Strode and Michael Myers is established through the use of subjective camera work. Similarly, Nancy Thompson of A Nightmare on Elm Street shares a disturbing connection with Freddy Krueger due to the fact that her parents took an active role in his death by immolation. These explicit links between heroine and villain serve to symbolically highlight their archetypal compatibility in the film's narrative. The final girl and the killer embody opposing psychological principles and are therefore ideal adversaries, as their encounter at the conclusion of the film resolves the tension that is built throughout the narrative. Despite their differences, both the heroine and villain in the slasher film frequently exhibit the quality of sexual frustration that is expressed through the violence that they perpetrate against one another. The sublimation of the heroine's sexuality into acts of aggression allows her to appropriate and manipulate the killer's weapons. This quality of the final girl also results in a bizarre kinship with the villain, as he similarly exhibits a repressed and/or sublimated sexual drive. Their savage interactions are consequently transformed into expressions of libidinal energy, and the prospect of death becomes a metaphor for the consummation of the sexual facets of their relationship. Perhaps the clearest illustration of this notion is presented through the violent clashes between the characters of Michael Myers and Laurie Strode in John Carpenter's Halloween. Throughout the course of the film, it is insinuated that Laurie and Michael share a unique relationship rooted in sexual repression. Both heroine and villain have sublimated their energies into alternate activities, resulting in Michael's preoccupation with violent acts of destruction and Laurie's fixation on her schoolwork and other responsibilities. This quality is noted in both characters by John Carpenter, who described the film as the revenge of the repressed. Similarly, Kendall Phillips points out that both Michael and Laurie are sexual misfits with stunted and immature libidinal drives, a fact which explains why they are presented as mirror opposites in the film. However, their contradictory natures are what paradoxically bind Laurie and Michael together, as they are united through their symbolic opposition to one another, representing the conflicting forces of life and death. Within the microcosm of the film, it is repeatedly suggested that these two antithetical characters are fated to meet and are perfectly matched to wage battle, permitting them an opportunity to externalize their sexual energy through a series of violent confrontations. In a perverse twist, Laurie and Michael are posited as bizarre lovers in the narrative structure of Halloween, bound together by their mutual plight of sexual frustration. This notion is established early in the film, when Laurie is asked by her father, a real estate agent, to leave a key under the mat of the Myers house so he can show it to prospective buyers. Unbeknownst to Laurie, as she walks onto the Myers property, she is being watched by Michael from inside the house, and upon catching sight of this young woman trespassing on his property, he becomes instantly fixated on her. Through the screen door of the Myers house, the camera captures Michael's silhouette rising from the shadows as Laurie walks up the front steps of the porch to drop off the key. The over-the-shoulder camera shot of Myers places Laurie and him in the same visual space and forces the viewer to witness the heroine through his desirous eyes. As the scene continues, Laurie begins her journey to school, humming a lullaby to herself that features the lyrics, "I wish I had you all alone, just the two of us," all the while oblivious to the fact that Michael continues to watch her. Again, Carpenter utilizes an over-the-shoulder shot of Michael on the sidewalk outside the Myers home as Laurie walks away, thereby hinting at a sexual connection between these two characters. This reading of Carpenter's direction is supported by the fact that in the soundtrack to the scene, the audience can hear Laurie's singing, overlaid with the unsettling and almost sensuous sound of Michael's heavy breathing. This sequence insinuates that Myers is the fulfillment of Laurie's repressed desire to have a boyfriend, and establishes a disturbing link between the two characters. In a later scene, it is further suggested that Laurie and Michael not only share a psychosexual connection, but their eventual encounter at the conclusion of the film has been preordained. As Laurie sits in class, listening to her teacher discuss the concept of fate in relation to the text The Life of Collins by moralist Samuel Johnson, she glances out the window and catches sight of Myers on the street returning her stare. Carpenter's choice of a wide shot to capture the image of Myers on the roadway is intended to convey Laurie's point of view, and thus the audience sees him through her eyes. The teacher's monologue that can be heard in the soundtrack alludes to the fact that, much like Collins, Laurie is on a predetermined path that will culminate in her encounter with Myers. Fate caught up with several lives here. No matter what course of action William Collins took, he was destined to his own fate, his own day of reckoning. As the teacher concludes her lesson, Laurie once again glances out the classroom window to discover that Myers has vanished, insinuating that he is a manifestation of Laurie's imagination and sexual frustration. This scene lays the groundwork for the peculiar sexual bond between heroine and villain that will later be fulfilled through their violent interactions. Sexual repression is a pervasive theme in the slasher subgenre, and functions as a consolidating force that connects the final girl and the killer. In these films, the villain is able to release his libidinal impulses through the ruthless act of unjustified murder. This savage behavior serves as a symbolic substitute for sexual intercourse, and thus the relationship between victim and killer is metaphorically consummated. This disturbing correlation between sex and death in the slasher film was noted by Robin Wood, who argued that the release of sexuality in the horror film is always presented as perverted, monstrous, and excessive. This accounts for the fact that the deaths of female victims in the slasher film tend to be particularly prominent and graphic in nature. Through their demise, the villain's female victims are quite literally transformed into the brides of death, who often keeps their mortal remains in his lair as trophies. These secondary characters are therefore of key importance in the narrative structure of the film, as they anticipate the villain's meeting with his final bride, the heroine, who is frequently a chaste female. This narrative structure is presented in A Nightmare on Elm Street, whereupon Freddy is posited as Nancy's perverted love interest, and their violent exchanges function as manifestations of their libidinal energy. Freddy is more overtly sexualized than Myers, and possesses a carnal appetite that is both insatiable and depraved, expressing his libido through sadistic acts of cruelty that often result in the death of his victims. In fulfilling this task, Freddy will posit his victim as a sexual object for his personal enjoyment, a dynamic that is particularly prevalent in relation to Nancy, since she is the central target. In an interview, the actor Robert Englund commented on this practice when he pointed out that by entering Nancy's dreams, as well as those of her peers, Krueger is able to violate his victim in an unprecedented fashion. Freddy's in those teenage girls' bedrooms. He's in their bed with them. That's more of a violation than rape. Freddy's preoccupation with Nancy is motivated by the fact that she possesses opposing psychological qualities, and therefore represents his ideal adversary. The sexual battle in which they are engaged is therefore rooted in their archetypal properties, and Freddy's desire to murder Nancy is a manifestation of his longing to destroy her narratological role as a force of goodness within the community. In response, she struggles to protect herself and her peers from the destructive force of the villain and ensure a future for the citizens of Springwood. The strange sexual tension between Nancy and Krueger is one of the central driving forces behind A Nightmare on Elm Street, and becomes an increasingly conspicuous element as the film progresses. This theme is clearly implied during Nancy's fourth dream sequence, when she is attacked by Freddy while lying in a bathtub. As Nancy soaks in the warm water, Krueger's glove emerges from between her legs, directly juxtaposing the soft flesh of her thighs with the tarnished steel of Freddy's claws. Transforming the tub into a pit, Freddy grabs at her naked body and attempts to drag Nancy down to a watery grave. Douglas Rathgeb states that this scene is intended to imply that Nancy and Krueger are potential sex partners, and that they have somehow become compatible within the film's moral scheme. Indeed, as the film progresses, Freddy increasingly becomes the physical embodiment of Nancy's sexual frustrations, and the nightmarish manifestation of her dream lover. This notion is revisited in a later scene, when Nancy tries to desperately contact Glenn via the telephone in order to save him from falling asleep and becoming another one of Freddy's victims. However, instead of reaching Glenn, Nancy hears Freddy's chilling voice on the other end of the line, telling her, "I'm your boyfriend now." The phone then partially morphs into a tongue, a manifestation of Freddy's dream power, and begins violently licking Nancy's lips. Commenting on this scene, Rathgeb argues that Krueger's objective is to become Nancy's dream lover, to legitimize sexually the union of their two rapidly converging worlds. Actress Heather Langenkamp, who played the role of Nancy, echoes these sentiments in an interview, stating that Nancy and Freddie's relationship has always had a sexual component. These strange and unsettling vignettes between Nancy and Freddie clearly illustrate the convergence of sex and violence in their relationship, which functions as the centerpiece of the film. Kruger's continued use of perverted sexual innuendo in his interactions with Nancy is rooted in the fact that she is his ideal foil and represents his ultimate challenge, both romantically and psychologically. The sexual link between the final girl and the villain reaches its culmination in the dramatic confrontation that generally occurs at the conclusion of the slasher film. The act of facing the killer marks a moment of transformation in the life of the female protagonist and symbolizes her graduation into adulthood. By confronting death, personified in the form of the villain, the heroine transitions into a state of consciousness, whereby she is aware of morbidity in the world. Much like the act of heterosexual intercourse and its potentially harrowing consequences, which includes the breaking of the hymen and the possibility of pregnancy, disease, and death, surviving her encounter with the villain signifies that she is no longer a child, but has become a woman. As Molly Haskell indicates, for heterosexual women, crossing the threshold into adulthood is a treacherous moment, as sexual penetration is more a terror than an opportunity. For the final girl, this rite of passage is experienced purely on the symbolic level, as the heroine and villain never consciously acknowledge the sexual implications of their actions, nor do they physically consummate their relationship. Instead, the violent interactions that they share function euphemistically to express their libidinal energy and externalize their sexual drives. According to Sue Short, by confronting the villain, the final girl embarks on a journey to acquire truth and identity, and along the way showcases her strength, ingenuity, and elevated sense of awareness. Clover supports Short's reading of the heroine's experience in the slasher film, explaining that when the final girl stands at last in the light of day with the knife in her hand, she has delivered herself into the adult world. As Short and Clover demonstrate, the curious and compassionate nature of these women may place them in peril, but it is also what leads them out of danger and transforms them into heroines. I agree with the observations of these scholars and argue that Newman's writings provide a psychological grounding for their insights. This encounter with death manifests in the form of a transgression. The slasher villain will either violate the heroine physically, as seen in Halloween, or on a psychological level, as displayed in A Nightmare on Elm Street. In the slasher film, the female protagonist is victimized by the villain, who attempts to sabotage her sense of selfhood and thereby annihilate her. The act of facing the killer symbolizes an encounter with death, and the final girl's ability to survive this experience is predicated on both her intellectual acumen as well as her physical agility. Through the appropriation and manipulation of the villain's weapon, she is able to externalize her sexual energy through acts of aggression and self-assertion. By defending herself and thwarting the killer's attacks, the final girl is able to reach psychological maturity and fulfill her potential. Thank you very much.